In 1965, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister of Britain. The country was going through an economic and social decline, with inflation rising, industry struggling, and labour strikes threatening national stability. Pushed aside into the background, a different Britain lingered. The old ways. Represented by aristocratic military figures like Lord Mountbatten, a symbol of empire, tradition, and military strength. Mountbatten was a decorated World War II hero and former Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. He refused to accept the direction in which Britain was heading. Mountbatten saw Wilson's economic policies, particularly his decision to devalue the pound, as disastrous. Britain's role as a global power was fading, and in Mountbatten's mind, something had to be done to stop the decline. This leads us to one of the most mysterious and controversial episodes in modern British history: the alleged coup to overthrow Harold Wilson's government and install a military dictatorship under Mountbatten's leadership. Now, while the coup never materialised, and most people don't even know that it even happened, today we are going to be asking, what if Lord Mountbatten's coup had succeeded? On the 18th of November 1967, Harold Wilson called a meeting with Lord Mountbatten to order him to reduce Britain's military spending. But Mountbatten, a hero of the Second World War, refused. The Prime Minister told him to resign immediately. Furious, Mountbatten felt betrayed and believed that Harold Wilson was leading the nation into a downward spiral of social and economic decay. In Mountbatten's defence, Britain as a nation had declined since the Second World War, which is an ironic fate since the Second World War was Britain's ultimate achievement. Mountbatten, as Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia, had played a significant role in the war effort. However, he saw Britain's empire slipping away. His legacy would see him humiliated as the last Viceroy of India. In his mind, he was the man to reclaim Britain's former glory. At the Royal Ascot in 1967, Mountbatten joined his great-niece, Queen Elizabeth II. At this time, it is unknown whether or not Mountbatten was considering a military takeover of Britain. In July 1968, Prime Minister Harold Wilson met with the Queen and informed her that he was going to further devalue the pound. Historians have a saying, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. It genuinely baffles me how short-term thinking is seemingly embedded into human nature. The Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and every other society to eventually fail devalued its currency and suffered economically in the long term. Harold Wilson was the exact wrong person to be Prime Minister. Wilson was the kind of guy to poke a hole in a life raft with his fork just because. Now, what happened next almost shook Britain to its core and could have changed history even more than the war itself. Now, I want to know in the comments, before this video, have you ever heard of Lord Mountbatten? Be honest. Mountbatten called a meeting with his military contacts and key associates, such as Cecil King, the director of the Bank of England and chairman of the International Publishing Corporation. Now, what happened during this meeting remains unknown. However, it was concluded that Britain was failing and that Harold Wilson and his cabinet were seemingly incapable of fixing it. In an unprecedented move, these men planned to stage a military coup, overthrow the government, and place Lord Mountbatten in charge under martial law. This really happened. The group began planning their strategic move. They needed to arrest the Prime Minister while securing control over the media, the police, the courts, and ultimately the British people. The men concluded that the only way that the coup was going to be successful is if Queen Elizabeth II herself dissolved Parliament and put Mountbatten in charge. As the head of the armed forces, she commanded widespread respect and had the backing of the British people. But the timing could not have been worse, or better. The Queen was away in France researching training methods for her horses. By the way, a bit random, well, I mean, it's random history videos, but did you know that the Queen actually spoke fluent French? Anyway, Mountbatten wanted to speak to the Queen and ask her permission. The Queen's associates passed the message on to the Queen, but then the Queen needed to go to Kentucky in America because that was the world leader of horse training at the time. So he had to wait. Another random history fact: the Queen didn't really want to be the Queen. She saw it as a duty, but it wasn't what she actually had the ambition to do, which is probably the exact reason why she was so good at it. She actually wanted to breed horses for a living. Now this trip was probably her at her happiest. In July 1968, Mountbatten finally met with the Queen to ask her to declare him in charge and arrest Harold Wilson. Now, we will never know exactly what happened in this meeting, but the answer was a firm no. But what if she'd have said yes? Let's do an alternate history, shall we? On the morning of the 1st of March 1968, Britain woke up to a nightmare. The military had seized control of Parliament in a swift, coordinated operation. Harold Wilson was arrested and escorted out of Downing Street under heavy guard. Newspapers and television broadcast framed the coup as a necessary intervention to save Britain from economic collapse and political instability. The message was clear. Wilson's government had failed, and Mountbatten had stepped in to restore order. That evening, Lord Mountbatten appeared on live television, sitting behind a desk in full military uniform. His speech reassured the public that this was a temporary measure and that democracy would be restored once Britain was stabilised. Some believed him, others were rightfully scared. The streets erupted in protest. Trade unions, student activists, and Labour supporters flooded London, demanding Wilson's release. But the response was swift. Military curfews were enforced, arrests were made, and violent clashes broke out in cities across Britain. The police sided with Mountbatten's forces, primarily due to the Queen's support for the coup. The coup was now complete. Britain was no longer a democracy. The new administration wasted no time consolidating power. Parliament was dissolved, elections were suspended indefinitely, and strict emergency laws were enacted, and strikes were outlawed. The press was placed under governmental control. Prominent Labour leaders were arrested, exiled, or mysteriously disappeared. The BBC, newspapers, and other media outlets were instructed to promote national unity under the new government. Now, it's worth noting that in a time before the internet and social media, access to information was scarce and limited to a small number of outlets like the BBC. Opposition voices were silenced, but underground resistance began to take shape. Secret meetings were held in basements and back rooms, where those loyal to the old government whispered plans to restore democracy. The rest of the world reacted with shock. The United States, though initially cautious, publicly condemned the coup. Britain's NATO allies feared the instability would weaken Europe's position against the Soviet Union. And the Kremlin seized the opportunity to declare Britain's coup proof of Western hypocrisy. Across the Commonwealth, Britain's former colonies distanced themselves from the new regime. Canada and Australia expressed outrage, while African and Asian nations saw the coup as evidence that Britain was still clinging on to its imperialist past. Countries such as Jamaica and Bermuda also used the coup as an opportunity to declare full independence from British sovereignty. Despite the international backlash, Mountbatten stood firm. He declared that Britain would no longer be dictated to by foreign interests. Travel restrictions were imposed and diplomatic relations with key allies deteriorated. Economic sanctions soon followed, plunging Britain further into crisis. Trade agreements collapsed, unemployment soared, and food shortages became a growing concern. By 1969, Britain was under full authoritarian rule. The Queen, still a symbolic figurehead, remained silent on the political turmoil. Mountbatten, once a hero of World War II, now ruled Britain as a de facto tyrant. His government maintained control through propaganda, censorship, and a network of informants. He believed that he was doing the right thing, but he was aware of what he was. Power corrupts even the best of men. Now, soon enough, cracks began to emerge. The economy continued to decline and public unrest increased. Student protest intensified, demanding a return to democracy. The once seeds of resistance, made up of Labour loyalists, military defectors, and disillusioned citizens, had now grown into a mighty forest. Talks of rebellion echoed throughout the nation. Even within Mountbatten's own administration, doubts began to creep in. Senior military officials started questioning the long-term viability of the regime. Some argued that the government had gone too far, and that Britain's isolation was unsustainable. Others feared that an armed insurrection was inevitable. Behind closed doors, discussions of reversion to parliamentary democracy took place. By 1971, Mountbatten's grip on power was slipping. Protest had gone into full-scale riots. The Queen, who had remained largely silent, finally intervened. The monarchy, still holding sway over the military, persuaded Mountbatten to step down. Facing overwhelming opposition, he had no choice but to resign. Elections were scheduled and Britain returned to democratic rule. But the legacy of the coup lingered. Trust in the military, police and the Queen was shattered, and the political landscape had been permanently altered. Britain's brush with dictatorship left a deep scar on its national identity. Now, in reality, the coup never took place because Mountbatten lacked the Queen's support. But this hypothetical reminds us of just how fragile democracy can be. If just one conversation had gone differently, Britain could have found itself in a military dictatorship. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Have you enjoyed the video? If you have, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and have a great day.